Okay, well, welcome. And we're pleased to have with us today at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, Dr. Tom Mahnken, a close friend of mine, and I think the right person to speak on this topic of U.S. grand strategy and the Ukraine war, something that we need to consider as we approach the anniversary, the first anniversary of the outbreak of the Ukraine war and America's role in it. Tom Mahnken is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington, D.C. He is also a Senior Research Professor at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies, also in Washington. He currently serves as a member of the congressionally mandated 2022 National Defense Strategy Commission as a member of the Army Science Board. His previous government career includes service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy Planning from 2006 to 2009, where he helped craft the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review and the 2008 National Defense Strategy in the Office of Net Assessment and in the Non-Proliferation Policy Office in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So deep service there in the Pentagon. I'm sure we crossed paths sometime during the surge in Iraq. He served as a member of the 2018 National Defense Strategy Commission and on the Board of Visitors of the Marine Corps University, where he and I also overlapped. He served on the staff of the 2014 National Defense Panel, the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the United States Regarding Weapons of Mass Destruction, and the Gulf War Air Power Survey. He is most recently the author of Net Assessment in Military Strategy, Retrospective and Prospective Essays, along with nearly a dozen other significant publications, books, and articles. So please welcome to the podium Dr. Tom Mahnken. All yours.
Thank you, Professor Mansour, for that kind introduction. And I know it's obligatory to say I'm pleased to be here, but in this case, it also happens to be true. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's also an honor. I mean, as somebody who grew up, reading things that had been published by folks associated with the Mershon Center, having friends and colleagues here, and finally getting a chance to visit. It's great. And today is certainly an appropriate occasion and an appropriate opportunity for reflection. We're one day short of the 1-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the topic is sort of future-oriented. But I think as with most or many topics that I cover, I will get to the future by way of the past. And so to start us off, I would ask us all to reflect back as to where we were a year ago today. I'll tell you where I was. I was, on February 23rd, 2022, I was furiously preparing for class. I was getting ready to teach a session of a brand new course that I was co-teaching on intelligence for a brand new master's program that I co-direct at SAIS. And not really by the luck of the draw, but by the luck of the syllabus, I was teaching the next morning on the topic of intelligence and war. And I had a bunch of, I thought, pretty good readings that I'd assigned, and I set about to get ready to teach the following morning when the news of the impending Russian invasion came across the internet. And so I did as any good professor would do and threw away my notes and winged it. And in fact, I think that class that morning on February 24th was really one of the most fulfilling, one of the most profound experiences I've had in my teaching career, because we collectively were forced to confront a lot of emerging, fast-moving developments. There were a lot of unknowns, a lot of fundamental questions, and we tried to reason them through. And so I think it's appropriate, just short of a year anniversary of that, to look back, but to look back by way of, as a preliminary to looking forward, at what we got right, and perhaps more importantly, what we got wrong. And when I say we, I'm being inclusive here, but primarily I mean members of the military profession. And at least when I say members of the military profession, I'm not talking about people who have served in uniform, who are in uniform. I am talking about people who are interested in issues of war and peace. I think those of us who are interested in war, in issues of war and peace, are members of that greater community. So I think it's incumbent upon us to look back and figure out what we got right, what we got wrong, and particularly when it comes to what we got wrong, why? What can we learn, right? So everyone these days is looking for insight, looking for lessons. I'd like to contribute that, but really contribute to lessons by through the lens of fallacies. What type of fallacious thinking do people engage in when it comes to issues of war and peace? And then turning that around, what does that tell us about war and peace, and what can that tell us about the future? So I want you to take a journey with me. And this is a journey that'll proceed chronologically, starting with more than a year ago. And it's a journey in 4 parts. Yeah, this talk is really organized into 4s. And when I get, just preview, when I get to lessons, that's also in 4s. This is a journey in 4 parts, proceeding chronologically. And along the way, we're going to stop and point out some fallacies. And I will use some examples. I'll use some quotes, not to shame any individual. I probably won't even mention the individual authors. I will use some direct quotes. It's not about naming and shaming. It's about talking about the prevalence of some fallacious thinking. And when it comes to war and peace, and again, we can apply that to other cases in the past. We can also apply it to the future, but we should learn from it. So let's start. Let's start on our journey. And so the first stop in our journey is back in the last months of 2021, the first months of 2022, before February 24th, 2022. And if we go back to that period, one of the things that we encounter is a series of fallacies about the rationality of war and the rationality of adversaries. So let's say a couple words of introduction, right? So when I talk about rationality, I just mean a relationship between objectives and means sought to achieve those objectives. It doesn't have to be my rationality, your rationality. I have a pretty low bar when it comes to rationality. Really, that there is a relationship between ends and means. And so the first fallacy I want to talk about is the fallacy of the irrationality of war. And this is a belief, a prevalent belief. I would say it's a pervasive belief in American culture that war is the result of the breakdown of policy, rather than, as Clausewitz would remind us, is a continuation of policy, right? That wars occur because of mistakes on one or both sides. How many times have we heard that, right? If a war is going to come, it's going to be because of mistakes on both sides, as opposed to a deliberate, calculated act. And I think I will say many of us believed in the lead up to February 24th that Putin was doing the things he was doing not because he sought war, but for other reasons, bluffing, leverage, something like that, right? And here I'll give you, these are a couple of extracts from testimony before the British House of Commons. And the date is February 8th, 2022, and the witnesses are two military experts. And I don't mean that ironically, by the way. Solid military experts. And I'll just, again, the names don't really matter, but I'll just read their testimony verbatim. Again, February 8th, 2022. Quote, "In terms of the present buildup, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's more about opening a dialogue between Russia and the US. There are obviously Russia's security concerns on Ukraine, but we know that a much bigger frustration for the Kremlin is the way in which it feels left out of some of the global discussions, whether that is right or wrong. This is not to excuse them, but my perception is that, for the Kremlin, this is much more about having a conversation with the big players around the table than it is about Ukraine. It's not that Ukraine doesn't matter, but that it's the order of the goals. That would be my perspective." This is witness number 2, speaking right afterwards. Quote, "I wrote an article about this, and I argued that the spring buildup was mostly about deterrence. It was about Russia trying to demonstrate to the new US presidential administration, as well as to NATO members, that it was not happy with the status quo in a couple of areas. One relates to Ukraine, and the buildup of forces was a way to demonstrate to Washington and other NATO members that Russia can make life difficult and potentially use military force." Anyway, so I think we can see that, that notion, that fallacy of the irrationality of war at play here, right? So he can't possibly be serious. Similarly, Vladimir Putin can't possibly believe that Ukraine is infested by neo-Nazis and the United States is behind everything, right? So that's fallacy 1. Related to that are a pair of fallacies about adversaries. So if we drop down from thinking about war and the rationality or irrationality of war, we encounter the fallacy of the irrational adversary. So this is the Vladimir Putin is crazy thesis, which I would say has its antecedent the Saddam Hussein was crazy thesis, which had as its antecedent the Slobodan Milosevic was crazy thesis, which had as its antecedent the Kim Il-sung was crazy thesis, and so forth and so on. The notion that the adversaries that we face are irrational. In other words, again, by my definition, well, they don't really have goals, or their goals are completely unachievable, or they're delusional of one sort or another. One encounters that a lot, and I think one still encounters that even now. Now, this fallacy has a fraternal twin, and that fraternal twin is the fallacy of the hyper-rational adversary, right? So there's one school of thought that our adversaries are just kind of crazy or delusional. The flip side of that is to imagine that our adversaries are strategy maximizing, effectiveness maximizing, coldly calculating individuals. So on that one, this is a quote published in a reputable foreign affairs journal, maybe named Foreign Affairs, in December 2021. And here's the quote. "Despite the Western media's predilections for depicting Putin as reckless, he is in fact cautious and calculating, particularly when it comes to the use of force. Putin is not risk averse. Operations in Chechnya, Crimea, and Syria are proof of that. But in his mind, the benefit must outweigh the cost. He won't invade Ukraine simply because of its leader's Western orientations." So taken together, these last two fallacies, the fallacy of the irrational adversary and the fallacy of the hyper-rational adversary, to my mind, boil down to or reflect one thing, and it's a lack of strategic empathy. Notice that I didn't say strategic sympathy. My argument is not that we should sympathize necessarily with, or let alone excuse adversaries, but we do need to empathize with them. Effective strategy does require understanding your adversary's mental state and what, and their beliefs. And it seems to me that whether we just term our adversaries as just sort of crazy and irrational, or imagine them as automatons, not human beings, either way, we're sort of ducking the real need for strategic empathy, to truly understand our adversaries. Okay, well, let's move on. Let's move on to our second stop. And I'll advance the clock slightly here. I'd like to move us up to the hours and days after the Russian attack. Again, I hope you can reflect back and try to think what you were thinking, what that was like for you at the time. Here, I'd say in the initial, the very first hours, days of the war, the thing I want to highlight was the challenge of assessing the military balance, the military capabilities of the belligerents. And I would say it's a particular challenge that the military profession has, and students of military history have, right, is trying to understand the military capabilities of belligerents outside of the context of a particular war. I think it's actually one of the things that makes the military profession a curious and in many ways unique profession. So, but now we move into the initial stage of the war, and I think we encounter a pair of fallacies. And these are fallacies of strategic assessment. And in a way, they are sort of two sides of the same coin. One is a fallacy of overestimation. In this case, it was overestimation of Russian capabilities. On the other side, it was underestimation, and it was largely underestimation of Ukrainian capabilities. Now, again, here I'll give you some quotes. These are all quotes from a single article, two authors, published on February 22nd, 2022, so just a couple days before the war, two respected analysts, and I'm just I'll probably read some topic sentences to you, but to give you a sense of what I mean by the fallacy of overestimation, the fallacy of underestimation. So this is a prediction, but it's a prediction on the very threshold of the war. So everything I'm going to read now is enclosed in quotes, so I don't bore you with saying quote, 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 quote. The Russian military would likely open its campaign with airstrikes. To carry them out, Moscow could use hundreds of bombers, as well as ground-launched cruise and ballistic missiles. Ukrainian air defenses are in short supply, and they would be unlikely to provide effective cover for most of the country's ground troops. They would be quickly overwhelmed. The opening air campaign would probably be short. It would then lead to a ground campaign, which would start by using helicopters to drop troops into Ukraine. Russia might also strategically drop paratroopers and airlift troops and armored vehicles well behind the front line to seize bridges or other infrastructure. Drones and combat helicopters would offer Russian ground forces reconnaissance and cover. In addition to relying on traditional firepower, a Russian operation would be supported by electronic warfare. Ukrainian commanders could suddenly find it impossible to use established channels to coordinate their response to Russian invasion, forcing them to use less secure means of communication. Achieving information dominance during a conflict is a cornerstone of Russian military strategy, and Moscow would also use its cyber capabilities to engage in psychological warfare. Now, this is the same article, and it's flipping over to the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian military has substantially improved since 2014, thanks to Western assistance, and has gained combat experience from the war in the Donbass. But the experience is largely limited to trench warfare and artillery skirmishes. Kyiv is still ill-prepared for a renewed Russian invasion of this scale. Ukraine's military is generally understaffed and has limited familiarity with warfare designed to surprise and disrupt enemies. Its ground forces are composed of thousands of conscripts with limited experience. Russian battalion tactical groups, by contrast, are filled with more skilled contract servicemen. Ukraine's air force is dated and stands no chance against its Russian counterpart. Ukraine is vast, which makes it impractical for the country's inferior force to mount an effective defense against an invasion. If it quickly found itself overwhelmed, Ukraine's military could embrace guerrilla warfare, breaking itself into smaller tactical formations with maximum autonomy. And the Ukrainian military could retreat to cities as a last resort, forcing Russian units into urban terrain, and so forth and so on. So I think there you see, again, an embodiment of what we saw, what we came to see as, right, an overestimation of the Russians, underestimation of the Ukrainians. Now, again, this is a reflection of a genuine problem, and that is, how do you extrapolate from peacetime evidence, from peacetime performance to wartime performance? It's a genuine challenge in military history and military affairs. But again, a lot of people got that wrong. Now, subsequently, I would say things have flipped somewhat. I think today, by and large, the narrative is one of disregard for the Russians, and thus, in a way, disregard also for the Ukrainians. So I think if one tries to have a conversation, as I've had with military leaders, about the lessons that we should learn from the war in Ukraine, almost invariably the conversation starts with, yeah, but the Russians suck. To which my response is usually, well, they might. I'll concede that, but presumably, or in some ways, they clearly are not performing up to standard. But presumably, the outcome of events on the battlefield is not merely the result of Russian weaknesses, but also things that the Ukrainians are doing. But I think we tend to devalue those things because we kind of overcorrect from our previous overestimation of the Russians. And so what I worry, of course, is now that that overcorrection, if you will, could blind us to further shifts in the course of the war. The Ukrainians are still doing pretty well. One hopes they continue to do well, but one's not completely sure. So let's journey on. Okay, let's move forward still through the initial campaigns of the war. Now let's stop. Let's pause for a minute and let's consider a couple of fallacies of interaction. So we talked about rationality, right? We talked about political purpose for war. We talked about rationality of belligerence. We talked a little bit about assessment. Now let's talk about interaction and adaptation. War is all about interaction and adaptation. It is an activity among two groups, two states, two or more belligerents. And so one of the central fallacies that one can engage in when it comes to interaction is the fallacy of script writing. The belief that you don't wage war against a thinking adversary, but for all intents and purposes, wage war against an inanimate object, and that you get to write the script. And at the root of it, this fallacy of script writing is a denial of the interactive nature of war. And we certainly see that on the Russian side, clearly. Clearly, based on what we know, which I think is only a fraction of what we will learn over time about Russian military planning, there was more than a little bit of script writing that went on, right? That the Russians made a whole series of very favorable assumptions, or favorable in their way, and about the Ukrainians, and thus they postured themselves for a quick, decisive victory. But the script writing, I think, wasn't confined to the Russians. More than a fair share of Western military experts also engaged in script writing. And so here I'll give you a quote. This quote is from an article, and in this case I'll read you the title of the article because it's all in the title, it's all in the lead. This is an article entitled, "The West's Weapons Won't Make Any Difference to Ukraine." And here's a summary of the author's argument. Quote, "In short, the military balance between Russia and Ukraine is so lopsided in Moscow's favor that any assistance Washington might provide in coming weeks would be largely irrelevant in determining the outcome of a conflict should it begin. Russia's advantages in capacity, capability, and geography combine to pose insurmountable challenges for Ukrainian forces tasked with defending their country. The second argument for aid, changing the course of war, thus does not hold water." Again, that is a form of script writing, right? And what that's doing is not only denying the interactive nature of war, but it's also again, it's a recipe for kind of strategic laziness and passivity. Now, of course, the war in Ukraine might have been a short war, right? If those opening campaigns had gone differently, if Russian forces had killed or captured President Zelensky, or President Zelensky and his government were forced to flee, the war might actually be over by now. The Russians might have actually achieved a quick, decisive victory. The fact is that they didn't. And thus, I guess we should be glad that the Russians fell prey to the fallacy of script writing, because in fact, because of that, a short war has turned into a protracted war. Now, come back to this in a few minutes, but protracted wars are fought and won on a basis different than quick, decisive victories. Certainly I think the Russians are having some difficulty adjusting, but they are adjusting. And so that takes us to where we are today, our fourth final stop on this journey, and it's from the perspective of February 23rd, 2023. It's where we are today. And so now, almost a year on, lots of people are talking about the end of the war. A lot of people are talking about war termination. And so to close out our journey, I fear that today we will fall prey to a final fallacy. And that's what I call the fallacy of decisive victory. Because we are, I think, as a people, as a country, we're so uncomfortable with the notion of war, and because we're by and large a nation of optimists, we like to think we can just sort of come up with clever ways to get out of things. We can wish it away in various forms, and one way that we do that is through this fallacy of decisive victory, the idea that we'll have a decisive end to this conflict. Now again, and one sees this in all sorts of wishful thinking, right? Like, well, what if Vladimir Putin is overthrown tomorrow? What if he slips in the shower? What if, and all of those are, I'd say, plausible. There's a greater than 0% chance of any of those things happening, but I don't know that any of those is a reliable, source of strategic insight, right? And again, we could talk about other cases where we engage in this sort of wishful thinking as opposed to thinking through some uncomfortable realities. So we should probably take a step back and ask the question of, well, why, how do wars end successfully? Well, they end successfully either with the overthrow of one side or the other, or through some sort of a negotiated settlement. And what determines, that endpoint is really a balance between how far you go militarily and what you demand politically, right? The farther you're able to go on the battlefield, the more you're able to demand politically, and thus we see, right, on both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, trying to push things on the battlefield because they hold expansive aims, right? Zelensky has said reconquest of all Ukrainian territory. Putin's still dedicated to the complete and utter overthrow of Zelensky's government. So they're still dedicated to unlimited political objectives, but don't seem to be able to match that on the battlefield. Now, if you can't match it on the battlefield, then you probably need to scale back your political objectives. And yet, neither side seems ready to do that. So as we hopefully, as this war hopefully draws to a close, and hopefully to a good close, we shouldn't fall prey to this fallacy of decisive victory. However much we may desire it, we're likely to be disappointed. So that's the journey. Having taken that journey, what lessons emerge? What lessons emerge for us, for the United States, both for the war in Ukraine, but also thinking about the future? And as I said earlier, this is a talk that's organized into fours. So unsurprisingly, I have four themes, four implications. First is that understanding the features of a future war from the perspective of peace is extremely difficult. Said it before, and I cannot emphasize it enough. And it is one of the most fundamental realities that the military profession must face, and one of the things that separates the military profession from other professions, right? So if you are a doctor, more specifically if you're a surgeon, more specifically if you're a 21st century variety of surgeon, you are used to performing the same procedure over and over and over again. That's the nature of the profession. If you're in business, if you're in stock trading, you perform the same thing over and over and over again. If you're a lawyer, if you're a trial lawyer, you do the same thing over and over again, and you and others can figure out over time how good you are, right? The military profession is quite different. Not to be too ghoulish about it, but let me go back to the medical metaphor. Imagine a surgeon, but imagine a surgeon, a surgeon that spends all her time reading the latest journals, using augmented reality and virtual reality to simulate surgical procedures, but only enters the surgical theater once a decade. And every time it's a different procedure, and again, not to get too gruesome, but to make it more of an apt metaphor, the patient on which she's operating is awake, not under anesthesia, and is reacting. That's the military profession. And so we should always be modest in our ability to understand and predict reliably the features of a future war. There's a lot of analogies being drawn between Ukraine and Taiwan, and more than happy to discuss that in the Q&A. But that fundamental reality of the military profession always needs to be in the background as we think about that. Second, understanding the character of a particular war, even after it's broken out, is a challenge. And here, I have to have a Clausewitz quote, because otherwise I can't show myself. My union card goes away and everything like that. So look, and there's a lot of wisdom in Clausewitz, and this is one of the wisest quotes. The first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and commander have to make is to establish the kind of war on which they are embarking, neither mistaking it for nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. Notice that Clausewitz writes that it's the first, the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment. I don't read the word easy anywhere in that quote or in the lines before it or after it, but it is absolutely fundamental. And if we can still argue fruitfully about the character of World War I, let alone the Vietnam War, and I think we'll be arguing interminably about the Iraq War. How should we believe that we can come up with cut and dried answers to wars that are ongoing? It's just very difficult. I also like this quote because Clausewitz has his own cautions, his own fallacies there, right? It's establish the kind of war that they're embarked on, neither mistaking it for something that's alien to its nature, right? That's a failure of assessment, or trying to turn it into something that's alien to its nature. Again, that's somewhat akin to that script writing that I talked about earlier. So that's a second big challenge. Third, as if that weren't enough, learning the right lessons of war is also extremely difficult. So I said, as military professionals, all that we can do is learn from history, ours and others, right? That's all that's out there. But even that task of learning lessons is extremely difficult. We could start with human cognitive psychology. We could go to all sorts of other cultural factors, limits to data. There's so many things, perceptions and misperceptions. There's so many things that make learning the lessons of history extremely difficult. And then finally, and particularly where we are now, I would just end with the observation that the determinants of success in long wars is different from short wars. Short wars are won on the battlefield. They're won through tactical and operational virtuosity. Oftentimes they're won because of real power imbalance or a skills imbalance, development of new operational concepts, new organizations, things like that, and ultimately the just sort of the collapse of the adversary. Long wars, and the war in Ukraine is a long war. They're won or lost based on societal will, political will, mobilization of national capability, allies, partners of various types, either bringing more allies onto your side, or robbing your adversary, or fracturing your adversary's coalition. It's very different, and the war that we see from that perspective unfolding in Ukraine is different from recent wars, recent kind of conventional wars, most of which have been short, but also very similar to long wars, protracted wars historically. So I think one of the things we'll also need to do as we're learning these lessons is kind of recapture the essence of success, the formula for success in protracted wars, which is just very different from our recent experience. So I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully I've said enough things that are controversial or at least partially interesting to fuel what I hope will be the best part of this, which is a discussion. So thank you very much. That's not fair.
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, you want to ask the first question? I'm like, how do you find it? Okay.
As your host, Tom, I'll take the privilege of asking the first question.
Take the first
There's been a lot of discussion of whether Putin would be willing to use nuclear weapons, and there's been a lot of discussion of what we would do in response. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to both of these sides of the equation and the chances of this war becoming a nuclear war.
Well, so that's a great question. So I think one of the features, right, of protracted wars is that they tend to escalate, and there are various ways. There are many ways that a war can escalate, right? And we've already seen this war escalate in various ways, and I mean it's escalated geographically. It's escalated in terms of the means used. And I mean, I would say even just a couple of days ago, Putin's announcement that Russia's out of the New START agreement, that's a form of escalation. And so I'd say the narrow answer to your first question is it possible? Yeah, I think it's certainly possible that at some point Putin could seek to use nuclear weapons. Now, I say that not to be alarmist, right? So there are some people that I think overplay that. I wouldn't overplay it, but I also wouldn't dismiss it. I think it all depends on the value that Putin puts on success in Ukraine, his belief in the prospects of nuclear use yielding success, and of course, what's the alternative? So is it possible? I think it's possible. I think we should, and here we is not just the United States, but NATO and frankly others, should be using every means possible to explain to Putin that the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Ukraine would be self-defeating. It wouldn't just not yield battlefield it wouldn't yield battlefield success, but it could very well lead to the end of his rule. That's the way I would think about it. The other thing I would point out too, and this is getting a little bit maybe a little bit wonky and a little bit nerdy, is the way that the Russian nuclear command and control system operates, at least our best kind of open understanding of that, is that it's a multi-part process. It's not like our system where the president has the nuclear codes and issues the order. It's in the Russian case, the president does issue an order. It then goes to the general staff, and the order then goes actually to the nuclear forces, strategic rocket forces. So there are actually multiple layers. So I think part of what we should also be messaging is, so part of the reality was if nuclear weapons were to be used by Russia and Ukraine, it would not be a single decision by a single individual. It would be a decision by at least 3 individuals. And thus, I think we would need to be very clear that we wouldn't just hold one individual responsible for it, that there'd be collective responsibility for that decision, because that's in fact what it would be. So,
Tom, I was intrigued by your discourse on the fallacies coming from the unnamed members of the military profession. You made it sound like everyone who commented on the war as it was during the build-up phase and after it was launched had things wrong, but I presume that there were some military professionals who had things right.
yeah.
What's the evidence on those statements that seem to be pretty good forecasts?
Yeah. So again, this was I was deliberately selective, and it was to illustrate these fallacies, right? Like I said, this wasn't about naming and shaming. It wasn't saying person A hit a home run, person B struck out. But I think there are, and this your question is a really good one. I'll give you an inadequate preliminary answer, because I know people who are looking at this issue more systematically. Let me answer it this way, which is I think at least in some cases, and this is everything I'm about to say is understandable, so it's not accusatory. Those who were closest to studying the Russian military tended to hold it in the highest regard. Again, those who were fascinated by kind of contemporary Russian developments and stuff, followed it. They tended to, in retrospect, overestimate Russia's capabilities. Those, and here's a good advertisement for the historical profession. Those with more of a historical perspective on the Russian military tended to make better calls, and I think it's because they tended to see. So those who were, I'd say, enamored of the Russian military tended to see discontinuities in the Russian military, reforms, things like that. And among other things, I edit or co-edit the Journal of Strategic Studies. We've published, like I'd just say over the last 10 years, a number of outstanding essays on the Russian military and Russian military reform. So what I'm saying here is not just about Ukraine, but just kind of more broadly about the literature. I think those who kind of studied it more closely tended to be more fascinated and tended to see more discontinuities, whereas those with more of a kind of a historical long-term view tended to see more continuities. And I guess I'm betraying my bias here. I think those, as we look at the Russian military and Russian military performance, I think those continuities tend to outweigh the discontinuities. And by the way, that doesn't all point towards Russian military incompetence, because, I mean, if you point to continuities, those continuities include the army that won World War II eventually, albeit through very, brutal, costly, draconian means, but they got to Berlin first. So that's one of my cautions. But that's, so I think that's one part of it. But I think it's your question again. It opens. It's a very excellent, broad question that at least some folks that I know are going to be spending some dedicated time on that in upcoming months and probably even years. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your interesting observations on the war. You mentioned the comparison of Ukraine and Taiwan in passing, and I just wanted to hear your take
Sure.
on that.
Well, okay, so I think there are. Let's talk about similarities and dissimilarities, right? And then we could also talk about lessons. But look, similarities. I think contemporary war is what contemporary war is, and so Ukraine has shown, that contemporary high-intensity war is munitions intensive. It's likely to be protracted. It's likely to be costly, and I think that would be true, in a war across the Taiwan Strait as it has been in Ukraine, right? So precision matters, all sorts of things. You can get learn lessons like that. But on the other hand, there are some key differences, right? So the Russians were able to, so Russian rail lines go all the way up to the border of Ukraine, both from Russia and Belarus. So in launching the invasion, the Russians had the advantage of literally just driving up to the Ukrainian border and then, of course, already occupying eastern Ukraine. So they had a little bit of a head start. Should China try to invade Taiwan, they'll have to get across the Taiwan Strait. Now, that's not an unachievable task, but it is a task nonetheless. And it's also, I think it'd be more of a challenge to then resupply forces across the Taiwan Strait than, again, by rail line all the way up to the border. Now, on the other hand, Ukraine's western border abuts NATO. In the case of Taiwan, you also have to deal with a maritime barrier on the other way too, right? Although Japanese territory goes right down to just off of Taiwan from the Southwest Islands. So that's a difference. What I would say, the other things I would look at are, well, what are the lessons that the PLA, the Chinese military, is learning from Ukraine? And as I think about that, I think about, I'll put it into three baskets. One is they can't help but see some things, and this has to do with the character of contemporary war, that should give them pause. Again, to the munitions-intensive nature of modern war, logistics, as I just talked about. And I think those pose some real challenges. But since policy drives strategy and politics drives decision for war, I don't now believe that just because of that, Xi Jinping is going to renounce claims on Taiwan and say this has all been a mistake and we'll just go do something else. I tend to think then that the PLA will look at Russian mistakes and how they might do things better. So, well, what are those mistakes? I mentioned one of them earlier, which was that the failure to decapitate the Ukrainian government early in the war. Again, if they had done so, the war would look much different. So I would certainly expect the PLA to redouble its efforts to be able to decapitate the Taiwanese government. And then we talked a little bit about nuclear matters. I think a reasonable Chinese critique of Putin is that he didn't rattle the nuclear saber early or loud enough. And so I would expect them to do much more of that. I mean, even before a conflict started. Because where the United States, I think in particular, has appeared quite risk averse is when it's come to nuclear matters. And then finally, I would think that the Chinese will learn a bunch of lessons that we wouldn't even think about. So one good example is the PLA historically has been committed to something that it calls political work. So the political indoctrination, I mean that they would see it in a positive light, political indoctrination of troops. Why are you fighting? And I think the PLA would look at Russia sending Russian troops to fight ethnic Slavs, largely co-religionists, even in some cases relatives, kind of under this pretense, that kind of flimsy pretense, not really equipping them with why they were going to war, as being self-defeating. And in fact, we saw that, right, with a plummeting morale on the Russian side, defections, also things like that. So I don't think we should count on the PLA doing something similar when it comes to Taiwan, but rather to really emphasize political work, to make the argument for, why such a war would be necessary. But again, that's an expansive question, and that's one that deserves more of more full of an answer than I can provide here. But that's a good one. Sure. Sir.
What would you assess the possibility that the Russian people, the oligarchs, or the army say enough of Putin?
Sure.
We've got to reverse this.
Yeah, so look, I think it's a possibility, but I'll go back to my previous point, which is, hope is not a strategy, right? So is it a possibility? Yes. Now look, the history of Russia shows that big battlefield defeats often lead to political changes, whether it's the 1905 revolution coming during the Russo-Japanese War, or the two 1917 revolutions in response to battlefield defeats in World War I. But that's what history shows, but I think Vladimir Putin is quite aware of that history himself. So I think we should count on him to try to safeguard himself against any such attempt to remove him. Even if he were removed, then the question is, well, who is he replaced by? Probably not Alexander Navalny, who's in prison, but as you say, an oligarch or somebody from the inner circle or something like that. And then the question is, would that be a distinction without a difference, or would because I say historically leadership changes can lead to to a resolution of a conflict? Yeah, maybe. Maybe this new leader would be motivated to cut a deal. Then I think the question on the part of Ukraine and Russia's adversaries would be, how acceptable would that deal be? To put it into again a what if, a historical counterfactual. What if Adolf Hitler had been killed by the plot to assassinate him, and had been replaced? Would the Allies have come to terms with Hitler's successor, or would they have driven on to continue the war towards unconditional surrender? I think those are really, really good questions, and I think there are contingencies we need to think about. My main point was just that we shouldn't pin our hope on something happening that we have very little control over.
First of all, thank you very much. And I have two questions. First, as a country that has, at least since World War II, either been a hegemon or been the primary leader in a hegemonic system, and has in many cases led the world in kind of academia and this sort of stuff, at least in terms of how it is seen, what are the greatest biases that you believe exist in academia about national security or war as a whole that come from our position? And second question is one that, is in the news a lot. Do you believe that our aid to the Ukraine is good or is in the U.S.'s long-term either economic or just general stability interests?
Okay, I'll start with the second one first. Look, I think that as long as Ukrainians are willing to fight and die for their country, we should help them. I think a corollary to what I talked about earlier of kind of the flip from the beginning of the war, where now the Russians seemingly can't do anything right, and so then we kind of like deprecate the Ukrainians. I mean, one of the ways that manifests itself is all this, I would say, self-congratulatory talk about all the great things that we've done for the Ukrainians. And I'm at pains to remind people that it's not Americans who are dying for their country right now, it's Ukrainians. And so, I think it is in America's national interest, and as long as they're willing to do it, I think that's perfectly fine. By the way, there's also a kind of a crazy, and I nominally have a degree in economics. I don't pretend to be an economist, but there also is kind of a crazy economic narrative out there, which is about all the value of all the stuff that we're giving the Ukrainians. Last time I checked, and it's almost getting to tax season, you do actually depreciate things after you've had them for a while. So a lot of what we're giving the Ukrainians has already been kind of depreciated. It's not, and so judging it by its value, if we were to buy it, if we were to buy a 1980s Abrams tank today, we'd buy a 2022 Abrams tank today. We wouldn't buy a 1980s one, and that's kind of what we're giving them. So giving it full market value is probably a little bit disingenuous. But no, so that's the way I feel about assistance to Ukraine. Let me ask, and I'll pose a counterfactual. Going back to the very beginning of our journey, right? There was, in the years leading up to the Ukraine war, there was a big debate over whether the United States should have provided Ukraine more military assistance. So let me posit the counterfactual. What if before February 24th, 2022, the Ukrainian military had been re-equipped with NATO standard equipment? So we'll rerun history. Let's just say, deterrence failed, whatever, Russia invades on February 24th, 2022 in this parallel universe, but Ukraine is equipped with NATO standard equipment. No larger military, no smaller, but it's all NATO standard. Just imagine how much easier it would have been to resupply Ukraine, right? So I think there's actually a powerful argument, not just in the case of Ukraine, but in case of others, and that includes allies like, say, Japan, actually them moving to like a NATO standard, their armaments, which they're not at right now. So that's that. Boy, biases in terms of strategic studies and military history. That's a wonderfully expansive question. Let me just take on a small part of that, and that has to do with the field of Soviet studies or Russian studies. And that was a field that got a lot of attention over the course of decades. As a matter of fact, when I was in college, when I was in graduate school, I got my proficiency in Russian. I got my proficiency in Russian months before the wall fell. And for many years, I felt like it had been a total waste, and my brain cells had been needlessly blown up learning Russian. Look, as a nation, we built up amazing intellectual capital when it came to the Soviet Union, and as a subset of that on the Soviet military. And in the years that followed the Cold War, a lot of that capital went away. So folks in academia who had specialized in the Soviet military went on to do other things. People in the US government went on to do other things. They became terrorism analysts. They became all sorts of other things. And over time, we drew down our intellectual capital on Russia. And as a result, as kind of Russian militarism and authoritarianism grew, we were surprised by things that we really shouldn't have been surprised by because we'd drawn down that intellectual capital. I could recite any number of anecdotes from my, well, actually probably couldn't recite any of the anecdotes from my time in government, but there were some, or sense where the Russians did things that, with historical understanding of Russia, the Russian military were completely predictable, but because we had drawn down our intellectual capital, everybody was surprised. And that's very different than, say, the profile of our intellectual capital on China, where we've basically been building it up over time. I still don't think it's sufficient. It's as deep as it should be, but that's sort of an upward trend. I'd say the picture when it comes to Russia is kind of borders on the criminal, at least as far as use of the taxpayer's dollar over decades and decades to build up this intellectual capital and then basically just disposing of it. So that'd be just one example. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really wonderful talk and fascinating discussion. I'm wondering, regardless of the specific result of the end of the Ukraine war, what will be the long-term ramifications? And here I'm thinking, my Europeanist colleagues will talk about the Spanish Civil War
Yeah.
and how that served as a bit of almost a technical training ground for the Second World War.
Sure.
And then my Russianist colleagues will talk about how this is going to affect Russian relations with Chechnya, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and kind of center-periphery relations in the former Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But one could also think about NATO and the EU and sort of rebalancing of military capabilities between the US and Europe.
Yeah, well, first I'd say, good colleagues, right? Because the first two were things that I would pick up on, right? So one is we've learned a lot about the character of contemporary war from this war. And as I said in response to the previous question, some of that will apply to other wars, whether, hopefully not, with China over Taiwan or others, but we've learned a lot about what contemporary war is all about. Another is, I'd say from the Russian side, right? So Russian history, at least one way to think about it, is this alternation between a conception of Russia as the easternmost extent of Europe, right? A Russia that's European or just on the doorstep of Europe, versus Russia that stands apart, right? Whether it's this Slavic or Asiatic or this unique identity. I think whatever happens going forward, that first vision is dead, at least for now. I think that the door between Russia and Europe is closed, locked, deadbolted, fortified. That's gone. And so then the question there is, what happens next? I think the other interesting thing, and it hasn't come to the fore yet, but it may very well, in a matter of days or weeks or months, is the Russo-Chinese relationship. And we talked a lot about interaction. That has to do not just with Moscow, but also Beijing. On the one hand, I think you could make an argument that this is the charitable argument that Beijing doesn't want to see itself shackled to a corpse. On the other hand, it could be a wonderful opportunity for Beijing to pursue its larger objectives, which include righting historical wrongs, not only when it comes to Taiwan, but also a bunch of things that Russia did to China on the Asian continent. So not a prediction, but stand by. But the overall, and it's not meant as an out or or ducking the question is, but just think that there's so much more that we don't know that we'll need to know, right, between now and then. But that's a start. That'd be at least my starting guess.
Thank you very much. In the past 44 years, we have seen 3 failed invasions of other countries.
Mm-hmm.
One was the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan for 10 years, and then they withdrew.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, Americans were in Afghanistan for about almost 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's another, maybe we do not call it an invasion, but it is intervention of 150,000 foreign troops in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
Now the third one that we are dealing with is now the Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that up to now, Russia is not succeeding.
Mm-hmm.
And in the first 3 or 4 years, and Afghans were totally considered to be really losing the war.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, somehow, the Soviet Union did not succeed in Afghanistan. Let me put it that way.
Sure.
Is there any lessons that the Russians have learned from their experiences in Afghanistan, especially what the coalition of forces which were supporting Afghans, Afghan resistance against the former Soviet Union? Now, what are the lessons that Russians have learned?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. So that's a good question, and I would say, you know, and this gets to one of the kind of the deep continuities, right? The Russian military, like the Soviet military before it, is dedicated to learning lessons. Russians believe in something called military science, which I think often kind of like strikes, unless you're in an ROTC program, in which case I think you take classes in military science. But outside of that, that strikes Western ears as being kind of weird. But in fact, that is a discipline in Russia. It's a discipline in China, by the way, too. And you can actually get quite far in the Russian military as a military scientist. So on the one hand, I mean, the simple, straightforward answer to your question is that the Soviets and then the Russians have spent a lot of time studying their own wars, including their war in Afghanistan and other people's wars. But I think what we see is that, you know, and this gets back to my point about how it's difficult, even under the best of circumstances, to really learn lessons. I think that you know, that study of their own past has a lot of pitfalls associated with it, and then even the bigger question is, how much does it matter? So the interesting thing that I think historians will be able to weigh in on, I don't know any evidence of it now, I don't think there would be, but to what extent was the Russian military consulted prior to the invasion of Ukraine, and what did their military science, what did their analysis of the correlation of forces between Russia and Ukraine show? In other words, what did their campaign planning predict would happen for this invasion? I don't think they predicted the way it turned out. And it's worth reiterating that whatever plan underpinned the invasion of Ukraine was produced by a general staff system and a military that advertises itself as superior students of military history and planners. Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about something that hasn't been discussed very much with the case of Ukraine? Dana Massacat of the RAND Corporation was on a panel this morning, which I zoomed in on, and she mentioned more or less in passing that a fair number of military analysts from the United States before the war were thinking that probably the Ukraine government and army would collapse, and what they'd do is instead the United States would support partisan or guerrilla warfare, particularly partisan or warfare in the cities.
Yeah.
And it does seem some of that has been applied. There hasn't been much discussion of it, but the behavior of the occupying troops in Bucha, for example, it suggests either they're total sadists or they're really desperate to try to get information about undercover operatives working within that area. The technique obviously worked very well in a lot of places against occupiers like the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the Soviets, or the Russians initially in Chechnya, and also in Afghanistan, and also against Israel in Lebanon. Do you see, it's conceivable that that would be effective militarily, but at far lower cost, which now seems, much of the military tactics seem to be sort of mindless lobbing of artillery. So I don't have very much information about that. There's been very little discussion of that, or basically partisan warfare or urban warfare in this area. But the Russians are occupying chunks of territory which has a lot of hostile people in it, and a lot of people who are not there now but could go back from the, and engage in that. So would you discuss that tactic a little bit?
Yeah, no. So I'll say several things. I mean, I think the irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare, stay-behinds, which is kind of what you're talking about here. On the one hand, that's a tried and true tactic for the weaker power. On the other hand, I think it poses challenges for a legitimate government. And an interesting question that future historians should examine, and I just put it that way because I don't think there's much basis on which to examine it right now based on the information that's available, is the extent to which the Ukrainian government planned for that in advance, and I'll just say let's just say from 2014 on, the extent to which the U.S. government counseled or advised the Ukrainians to do that again, 2014 to 2022. I think those will be interesting questions to look at. I think now if we start our journey back on February 24th, I think the problem is, and look, so I'd say that the problem for a government to overtly, and I'll just say for President Zelensky's government, overtly to embrace that type of a strategy is to concede that a Russian invasion would be successful, right? Now you can imagine stay-behinds as like a deterrent, but the idea here is really, no, you're conceding that you're gonna lose. And once the war kicks off, I think it's very difficult and I think it would be actually politically very perilous for Zelensky to concede that. And then plus, by the time February 24th rolls around, it's kind of too late to plan in a dedicated way for that type of an approach. Because you need to train people, that takes time, you'd want to pre-position stocks, you do that, not all that needs to be done in advance.
About it as now.
Yeah.
Which they've basically pushed out and they are occupying hostile
Right.
areas in the south.
Right.
Use it in that, and that's.
Yeah, so I think there again, the tension is going to be between Zelensky's goal of, if you will, not to steal somebody else's line, Ukraine, whole and free, and a strategy based on causing occupiers problems, right? And I'd concede that, and I would say similarly, if we transpose this to another theater, another part of the world, one could make a good argument that if the government of Taiwan were to embrace a people's war, stay-behind strategy, like seriously, that could pose a real deterrent to PLA occupation of Taiwan. But were the Taiwanese government to openly go down that path, again, it would concede that, okay, we can't hold them at the beachhead. So I think there's a challenge there. But I think that's it. But that ultimately that's going to be an area where I think we'll learn more. And I would say, personally, that in the opening days or weeks of the conflict, there was a lot of thinking about that. How could the Ukrainians and what could others do, and I say this as an academic exercise, what could others do to help the Ukrainians better resist occupation. But it hasn't really come down to that. So, yeah.
So I'm curious to sort of pan out to the strategic piece in terms of the relationship between the West and the Russians. There are two things in particular that you mentioned that I think are really interesting. I'd like to hear more about your thinking on them. The first was analysts that misunderstood the strategic worldview of the Russians prior to the conflict. And I put myself in this camp, right? So I thought that Putin's goals were basically to prevent NATO from bringing Ukraine in as a member, and that the 2014 war basically prevented that. And so it was a fundamentally stabilizing move, morally problematic, but fundamentally stabilizing strategically between the West and Russia. I clearly got that wrong. And so I'm curious sort of what was the sort of the worldview or the goal that we missed on Putin's part. And then the other thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was this idea that Europe is permanently closed to Russia. I have sort of the opposite prior, but I don't follow this closely. And so my assumption is that the fundamentals are such that the Europeans would probably like an excuse to go, with the exception of the British, because I think they're sort of like irrationally anti-Russian. But I think the Germans certainly would love an excuse to go back to business as usual if they can sort of like put a moral sticker on it in some way. And so I just wonder what the future strategic options are that we might plausibly offer the Russians. Because it seems like there's not a great alternative to continued fighting if you're Putin right now.
Yeah. So, well, I'm taking the second one first. In the end, I don't know that it's about us offering any sorts of inducements. I mean, meaning I don't think there are any inducements that we can offer Vladimir Putin that would change, that would fundamentally change his mind. And so that's, there's maybe there's another fallacy here, which is the fallacy of strategic narcissism, right? That we believe it's all about us. And oftentimes it isn't. And so I don't, no, I think part of the reason that he went down the path he did, by the way, so I don't think the invasion of Ukraine was a failure of deterrence, by the way, because I don't think he was deterrable. So in that instance, and certainly not by us. Ukraine's not the United States. It's not an ally. And so deterring an attack on a third party is something that, I'd say even if Tom Schelling were here with us, I think would say would be, kind of way over the moon in terms of anything we should hope for. So I just don't, now I realize that makes me sound like I just kind of like a variety of script writing, that there's nothing you can do, but I just think in this case, I think it's beyond that. And that takes me to your first question, which is, I think all you have to do to understand Vladimir Putin is to listen to his speeches and read his writings. And I mean, so for me, I remember very distinct, and this is not, it's not credit taking or anything like that, but I just remember for me, it was when I was listening to, it was on YouTube, his speech to the Russian people within a week of the war. Got to trot out without translation, without subtitles, trot out my rusty Russian. And the thing, I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting on our couch downstairs. My wife was upstairs, and I listened to it, and I just went upstairs, and my wife said, "What is it?" And I'm like, "He's serious." And it was not just what he said, but how he said it, with every bit of conviction. And it was all about, how NATO was using Ukraine, and all about this, and NATO was getting access to the Ukrainians had stolen parts of the Russian defense, the Soviet defense industry, and this and this and this. And there's two theses. One, and this gets back to the irrational adversary, right? So either Putin was just making all this stuff up, or he actually believes it. I think he just actually believes it. It doesn't mean we have to believe it, but we have to at least credit him with actually being honest in his convictions, and deal with him as such. So yeah, I think but just read what he said. I think some things he says under some circumstances for a deterrent effect and so forth, but that speech was not about a deterrent effect. That was about explaining why he was about to go to war. So yeah.
I was studying that what the Arab historians are saying, or what the Persian historians or Afghan historians, or the subcontinent of India. There is one common thing that you can find that invaded, because they have been subjected to many invasions throughout the history. They have long memories.
Yep.
They say that two of the adjectives that they're using for the failed invasions, we mentioned that crazy or irrational or whatever. They said two of the factors are very important. One is that it's a lack of history. Their own and the adversaries, that they're good. They're poor students of history. That's one thing. The second one is that arrogance. I do not know. That some of these rulers or whoever, strong men or women, they're just arrogant, among other adjectives. These two are very popular among these historians that I have studied so far.
Well, I think it's true, and again, I'll just say in the case of it's either lack of knowledge of history or a very kind of partial, slanted view of history, right? A self-serving view of history. And with arrogance, I mean, certainly, I mean, again, if you go back to before the invasion of Ukraine and the polling data that was available to Vladimir Putin about Ukrainian sentiments towards Russia, that data showed, would have predicted strong Ukrainian resistance to a Russian invasion. The data was available to him. Now, like, does that mean, like, was it actually shared with him, or was somebody hesitant to share it with him, or did he see it and dismiss it? Don't know. But there certainly was evidence there. So, yeah.
So we have time for one more question, which we're going to give to Danny here. Before we go, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out. This was the opening of our Mershon Public Lecture Series on war and security, and Dr. Mahnken did a great job. Coming up on the 9th will be Michael O'Hanlon, who will be doing modern history for the military historian. And then on March 23rd, we will have Mel Leffler, who will be talking about his new book, Confronting Saddam. On March 31st, we will be having the Iraq War Conference, Shock and Awe, which will be commemorating the 20th anniversary. And on April 6th, Dr. Mansour, Dr. Brayfogle, Dr. Curtis, and a whole bunch of other will be contributing Nature at War, American Environments in World War II on their book. So with that, having the housekeeping done, I will go to my last question.
Yeah, thank you. This is from our Zoom audience, John Hoffman. He asked, World War II is used to promote Russian militarism. Do Ukrainians draw inspiration from the history of Ukrainian Cossacks in the conquest of Siberia?
Oh, that's a great. So to that question, I'm a professor, so I got to give you homework, right? And I mentioned already the Putin speech. Another fascinating thing to watch is, and it's available on YouTube, watch the RT coverage, RT in English is fine, of various Victory Day parades commemorating the end of the Great Patriotic War, World War II. And I mean, you can go back years, and if you like military hardware, you're kind of like a military hardware junkie, it'll give you a fix there because you get all sorts of stuff. But the commentary is just telling. And this is, again, going to years before the war. And it's beautifully produced. I mean, Leni Riefenstahl would be proud of the production values. But on Ukraine, I remember watching one of these Victory Day parades, and the commentary, this is in English, again, it's like, they're just saying, like, well, of course, Russia bore a disproportionate cost, for the war, played a, we really were the ones who defeated Nazism, and there are people even on our doorstep that are like renouncing their medals from the Great Patriotic War and are not proud. They're talking about Ukrainians, and so I mean, even then you see it's not. I'm not saying this in a sort of a Machiavellian way that even then it was laying the pretext, but it was part of that narrative. That no, there was us and then the Ukrainians. I think for Ukraine, it is very complicated because you had Ukraine occupied, you had Ukraine fighting the Nazis, you also had Ukrainians collaborating. I think it's a very, it's a very complicated legacy for them. So, and frankly, I would say, even if you go and I think an honest conversation about the Soviet Union's role in World War II would be a fairly complicated conversation as well. But they're not having that in Russia right now, so maybe in the future.
Thank you, Tom, for a wonderful presentation. Please join me in thanking Dr. Mahnken for his appearance today. And I'm sure he'll be up front if you have any individual questions. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.